Which I mean how we go from a personal response to a text to using this to inspire our writing and make it better, and with a particular focus on how we do this for the students that we teach. So a bit of background about me: I'm an assistant director for Nord Anglia Education, and most of the time I'm based in Hong Kong. I work out of the Hong Kong school, but I also work across our global family of schools. And this webinar topic is really close to my heart because I started my career as an English teacher, and that is still my first love. So I'm talking about something that I'm really passionate about today. While I'm doing this webinar, I'm going to be talking. There will be time for a breakout room for you to participate and try some of the strategies. I'm also very keen for you to interrupt and put things in the chat or unmute and just join in the conversation. I want this to feel fairly informal. So please feel like you can join in at any time. Okay, so I've shown you these already. I just want you to look at these for a moment. And if you haven't already, I just want you to think of these sentences, and there are 5, which one do you like the most? And that's it. Which one do you think is the most beautiful? And why do you think that? And I don't need technical terms. We don't need to think about specific features. We're just going on personal preference. Which one do you love? And I'm not going to tell you mine yet. And you don't need to say them out loud, but just have it in your head, because I'm going to come back to these again and again during the webinar. These have been chosen from children's books. 1 or 2 are from slightly more grown-up books, and I picked them just because I liked them. You might have another sentence that you love in your head, your favorite sentence, your favorite quotation, and if you have, keep that, because you can use that later in the session as well. Okay, I'm going to move on. So in today's webinar, I'm going to be talking about how our reading and appreciation of books can inspire our writing. I'm going to be talking about how we value different forms of creativity, how pastiche and imitation are key strategies for fostering originality, which sounds like a bit of a tautology, like we don't always think about imitation as being something that's original, but I'm going to talk about that today and why it's important. And then we're going to talk about strategies for how we do that, and then metacognition and how we model the process. And we'll talk about this as we go through. So I'm going to be outlining a 3-step process today. I'm going to be outlining a learn, reading and personal response, practice, imitation at the sentence and feature level, and then transfer, how we use these strategies and transfer them into new contexts. And I'm going to pick up on each of these as we go through today. I'm also going to talk about how a teacher needs to model this practice at every single stage. So we need to model our enthusiasm in reading. We need to model how to practice and extrapolate from our reading through imitation. And then we need to model how to take this toolkit of new skills and put it in a new and unfamiliar context. And it's through this process that our students transfer their love of reading to creativity and success in writing. And this is how we're going to move from one to the other. Now, before I do this, I'm just going to talk a little bit about how we think about being a writer, because I think this is really important. When we think of artists, when we think of people who we think are geniuses, and writers often fall in this category, we often think about them as having like a skill which is inside them. It just comes out. They can just do it. It's amazing. They're a genius. They write and it's beautiful. And there we go. But actually, if we think about creativity, we can put it in 2 different categories. And this is based on the work of Gallinson. And Malcolm Gladwell's also talked a little bit about this. There are 2 kinds of creativity. We have conceptual innovators. And an example of a conceptual innovator that you can see on the left, you may have recognized him, is Picasso, right? Conceptual innovators. It just comes out like magic every single time. Every single thing they do is different. It's like genius. It just seems to come out of nowhere. They can do this very, very young. It's the student in your class who can just write and it's just beautiful. It's just like it sprang out ready-made. Then we have experimental innovators, and experimental innovators learn through craft. They do the same thing over and over again. And you can see on the right, this is the artwork of Cézanne, getting better and different, not even better, but different every single time. Focusing and refining, getting better in stages, thinking about, if I change this, is it better? If I change that, is it better? And here, excellence is learned. It's a long, slow process. But both of them are creative. Both of them are amazingly famous artists. And within our education system, we often privilege one over the other. We often think that our conceptual innovators, the ones who do it fast and out the box, are the ones who get it, who are the ones who are skillful in this area. That's what exams prioritize, a student who can go down and sit there and in an hour or an hour and a half produce something amazing. But actually, for a lot of our students who don't think of themselves as writers, we need to be talking about creativity as something that is developed slowly and in a dedicated way over time. You can be a creative artist, it's just going to take you a lot of work. An example we can see here from written creativity, from written genius, I guess, is we have The Great Gatsby on one side. Now, F. Scott Fitzgerald is what we think of as a conceptual genius. He wrote this very young, in his 20s, came out the box, it was beautiful. One of my favorite sentences is from this, he just made it. Hemingway, on the right, wrote A Farewell to Arms late in his career. He rewrote the ending of that book 47 different times. And when he was asked why he did that, he said he wanted to get the words right. Both of these are an example of success in writing. And I think we need to be communicating to our students that writing is something that gets better through trial and error over time with hard work. It isn't something you can do or you can't do. And I know a lot of students that I used to teach think of themselves as not being a good writer. But actually, perhaps it's that we're just communicating that actually writing is something that you get better at gradually over time. Like anything else, through practice, you just keep on going, keep on refining. Like our experimental innovators here on the right, it's a process which is unsure. We don't always know what we're trying to achieve. Each time you try something, it's a step towards the next thing. You're learning as you go. You learn to write as you write in an experimental process of trial and error. And we build these skills gradually over time. It's not something you can do or you can't do. It's something that you get better at and you work at and you work at. And that's a really healthy mindset for writing and something that I really strongly believe in because I love writing, but it is still the scariest thing I do. I find it really, really quite intimidating to put my words to paper. So a nice example here, we've got F. Scott Fitzgerald writing his best work, age 29. We've got Huckleberry Finn being written by Mark Twain, age 50. And what we find is our conceptual innovators get good early and then they die off. They produce it fast and early, but then they don't necessarily sustain it. But our experimental innovators, they learn and they learn and they learn, as you can see through this graph going up underneath, and they produce their best work later on. And I think that message for our students that you just keep practicing and you produce your best work, maybe later, maybe after your school career has finished, but it will be something you keep going with for your whole life, is a really strong message. Okay, so if we're positioning writing as something that you craft, not something that you can just do, then we need to think about how we teach students to craft and who we learn from in that craft. Because when we think about craft, we can learn from the experts. We can take what the experts have done and take that expertise and imitate it ourselves to learn how to do it. So the first thing we need to do is work out who we love, whose writing we feel is really, really beautiful. Who are the masters of this that we look up to? So one way of doing this, I'm just going to go to the next slide actually, is to think about your writing heroes. And as a teacher, Do you passionately communicate the writers that you really, really love? Not the books that you really, really love per se. It might be, but it's not necessarily the story that we're falling in love with here. It's the style of writing. Are you talking enthusiastically about the writing styles that you feel are excellent? And I've put some of mine here, just a random selection, but who are the ones you'd like to imitate? The best bit of teaching work I ever did on writing was actually an imitation of the writer Raymond Chandler, where my students and I all wrote detective fiction in the style of a hard-boiled detective from the 1930s. But you can use any author that you want to. And the idea is that you as a teacher come to the lesson with a writer that you're going to use as an example. And you're going to use that example really, really closely and imitate their style at a very, very detailed level. And so you know which ones you think are amazing and you're prepared to talk enthusiastically about. And then hopefully after a time, your students will get to a point where they know the writers that they want to write like. They know the writers that they feel are an inspiration that they turn to help them develop in their own writing style. And you do this at a writer level, the writers that you love, but you also do this at a sentence level. So if we go back here to our sentences here. So looking at these sentences, you've picked out already which one you liked. Could you now pop in the chat which of those sentences you thought was the most beautiful? And if you know why, could you put why? Okay, Liz, I love your comment there. You love the poetry and the flow. You love that it involved sight. You love the blues and the sadness, the whispering, the heat of summer, all of that. That passion is gorgeous. So being able to talk to why that sentence is your favorite sentence. Okay, the last one, because it creates images in your mind. And it's being able to talk to with a personal response, not necessarily the features, not necessarily the grammar of it, that you can, but it's also about saying just what you love. Okay, now unmute if you want to, but I'm happy to talk to the chat if you're happy for me to revoice your answers. The sunset one, because it's unexpected and beautiful and a little ominous. I know I loved that one and I kept it in, even though it's not a children's book, because the carnivorous flower is scary. The last one, because of the imagery. So I love listing in sentences. So you can see there's quite a lot with lists on here. And I like parallel structures where the start echoes the end. So I also like, there was a cough, a whisper, and a loud hush. And I like the fact that loud and hush don't really go together. That's great for me. And I'm going to steal that one for my own personal toolkit. So what I want you to do now is we're going to do an activity in a little bit. And I want you to have your favorite sentence in mind because we're going to use it. But the important bit I'm talking to about here is having a personal response to writing. So being able to say why you love it and why you think it's beautiful. I would often set an objective for a lesson that by the end, students wrote a sentence they felt was beautiful, that personally moved them. And they hopefully, after a while of reading and being able to do this, will be able to pick out sentences that they feel personally move them, sentences they just love. And modeling this as a teacher is really important. Are you able to say, this is a sentence, I just love it for this reason? That's going to be something I want to write like. You like the Robert Bolano one, Aubrey? Yeah, me too. Okay, so the first thing is personal response. Knowing which writers we love because of their writing style. Knowing which sentences we love, and sentence level is important. And being able to say, I love it because, and this is beautiful because, and modeling that to our students is something we expect them to do. The next part is to take that personal response, I love these writers, I love these sentences, and work on how we directly imitate what the writer has done there. So how do we take that writer's craft and turn it into our own? So this is a version of pastiche. Now, pastiche is really interesting. So pastiche is the art of imitation of other people's styles. It's often used for comic purposes. And actually, I'm not using it here for comic purposes at all. It's super serious. It's very well known in the art community. And it was a way for young artists, particularly in the Renaissance period, to copy the work of masters and through that learn their technique and their craft. Now, this is something that also works in writing. To copy the work of masters, not directly, but to copy the style of masters and through that learn their technique and their craft is something that is really, really valuable. So it's valuable because in choosing rich text models, by which I mean strong examples of writing, so not necessarily examples that I've written myself, or those can be useful, but examples from literature, I can provide examples of writing in context, writing that has been successful out in the world. A structured approach by which you say, here's an example, copy it, but change it a little to a different situation, is really good for learners who feel that they can't do it. That experience of sitting there with a blank page, not knowing what to write, it's much easier if you've got a structured example to copy and get you over that. High quality models extend higher retainers. So if you've got students who are already very good at writing, by giving them a professional example of writing, it shows where to aim for next. And after you've done this a while, with a range of different pastiche models, a range of different writers imitating from a range of different genres, your learners will have a whole toolkit of different styles and different kinds of sentences that they then start to draw on to develop their own personal voice. Now, I know that at the very upper end, we prize originality. We really do. You don't want to copy when you're going into exams or universities or places which feel very strongly about plagiarism, but that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the building up of learning throughout children's schooling so that they create, through looking at the masters of this craft, their own personal toolkit and their own writing voice. And this is a way that we can teach them to do this. There are some writers who talk about sentence imitation being a very, very valuable way of learning their craft. For example, Stephen King in his book On Writing talks about sentence imitation as being an honorable way to get started and a way of marking each stage of a writer's development. And then we also have Paul Butler saying that imitation allows students to be creative and to find their own voices as they imitate certain aspects of other voices. So I lean on Kilgallen's sentence composing when I do sentence imitation because I find it very, very straightforward. And I know there are other forms of imitation out there. There's been some work on things like Talk for Writing, Build It In. There are lots of different areas that look at this, lots of different writers who look at this. But Kilgallen's one is one that I find really straightforward. Now, I've put a bibliography in at the end because this is readily available out there on the internet for you to access. So I'm going to talk about three strategies here: sentence imitation, sentence expanding, and sentence unscrambling. So the first one is the most straightforward. And the text I've leaned on here as a good example of this writing is The Firework Maker's Daughter by, is it Philip Pullman or Michael Morpurgo? One of the two. Philip Pullman. So in this one, we've got this lovely sentence: a great drum sounded 3 times and an orchestra began to play, gongs and xylophones and drums and cymbals and flutes. Now, if I was going to teach the grammatical components of this directly, I would probably be focusing in on the listing. I would be looking at the placement of the comma. I would be looking at the placement of the colon. I'm not going to do this in this context. I'm just going to ask my students to imitate it. But I'm going to ask them to put it in a different situation. So here, we're not looking at a sort of musical orchestral situation. We're looking at a battle. And so if I was imitating it, but now for a battle, I could use, for example, a huge cannon fired 3 times, just substituting the words out and the soldiers began to attack. Muskets and axes and arrows and pikes and fists. It's a dramatic sentence. It sounds great. And I've just substituted the structure of one for the other using a sentence that I thought was beautiful. This is the most straightforward and often I find the most useful strategy to use. Another one that you can do is sentence expanding. So I've taken this one from The Warrior in the Mist by Ruth Eastham. And you could use whatever text you were using in class. So whatever book you were reading, you could borrow the sentences from that to support you in whatever style of writing you were doing. It's the value of using a rich text model in class, a really good book that you can then borrow from and imitate. So here my original sentence is, the horse's nostrils flared, his huge dark brown eyes glittered. So this time, I'm going to expand it. The car's engine roared, and just in your head, and if you want to in the chat, what could the rest of this sentence say? The car's engine roared, and it's his huge dark brown eyes glittered. It's something, 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 and then we've got this verb at the end. Now you don't have to write it in. I'm just going to think out loud. So it's large, growling engine, or it's bright, shiny, bodywork, steamed, for example. That isn't my best example because I'm doing it live in the moment. It's really important to do it live in the moment as a teacher to show the process of getting it wrong and being tentative and thinking about how to do it again. And yes, Rabab, this is really helpful in essay writing too. It's super supportive however you do this, not just in creative writing. I'm modeling it here with creative writing, but non-fiction essay writing, it works all over the place. So this is an expansion. And yes, the bright headlights glared, Liz, that's much better than my example. So hopefully you would start a conversation with your class at this point. How are we going to finish this? How do we go back and forth? The car's engines roared, its wheels screeched, and its headlights glared. Excellent example. And we can take all of these different examples and have that conversation about which one do we love most? Which one do we think is the most beautiful? And I love the idea of having beautiful as a criteria here because it's very open, but it's just about which one we feel is great. Okay, the final one. And this is sentence unscrambling. This is a bit more of a game. This is useful to do if you want to think about the order that your sentence is going, if you're prioritizing sentence structure here. Because with this one, there is a right answer in that the writer has chosen to do it one way, but any other order could be an okay interpretation as well. So I've taken a sentence, and I've taken a sentence this time from The Midnight Fox by Betsy Byers, and I've just broken it up into bits. And the idea is that you put it into the order that you want to, the order that you feel would make most sense. And you can actually do this with any sort of structure. You could do this at text level as well by breaking up paragraphs, or at paragraph level by breaking up sentences, or at sentence level by breaking up clauses and phrases. But here we've got watching, I close my eyes, the green, green grass, it's been 5 years, and once again, the black fox, but when by the creek come leaping over. I'm just going to give you a minute to look at that and think, what order would you want to put it in? And then once you've worked it out, can you say why that order felt right to you? Okay, if people are watching the recording here, you can pause and play this and do this as a puzzle. But for everybody else, I'm going to move to the answer now. Sorry if this is frustrating and you felt you were on the tip of this. It's interesting how tricky this is. It has been 5 years, but when I close my eyes, I'm once again by the creek, watching the black fox come leaping over the green, green grass. So that's a fun one to do for moving clauses about. And if you've got students who are struggling with their sentence structure, or you really want to think about different ways of starting sentences and doing it in a way so you're looking at how you don't always start with the subject, for example, or you want to start with different clauses and things like that, this can be a fun one to play with. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to have a go. We're going to have a go with just sentence imitation. Now, the important thing is you've read a text, or as a teacher, you've given your students a text. You've read through it purely for personal response. Which bits do you think really work? Which bits are beautiful? You as a teacher have chosen those initially for a student, but eventually your students are capable of identifying them for themselves. That's a really strong part of reading. And you've then said, right, we're not going to write about the thing this book is about today. We're going to write about something different. For example, we're going to write about Hong Kong. So we're going to use this picture as inspiration. You're going to write about it using these sentences as inspiration, maybe in the style of a particular writer, or maybe just using beautiful sentences to help us. So I'm going to pop us all into breakout rooms. You've got 10 minutes. In that 10 minutes, choose a beautiful sentence, maybe the one that you worked with before, and then try and write a sentence about Hong Kong using that as inspiration. And we'll just have a couple of goes and talk to each other about why you chose that sentence and whether you feel it worked, and write it together if you want to as a shared process. Just to call up the kind of things we've got here. Now, not everybody got a chance to write about it. Some people were just talking and that's fine, but just to call up some of these beautiful responses. We've got the sky at dusk looking like sparkling diamonds. I'm just going to move that one over here. And we've got a good example of sentence expansion. The sky at sunset looked like a carnivorous flower towering over the monstrous buildings, hovering like blocks of metallic magnets. I'm just going to pick a couple from each. They're all really lovely examples of how to expand these out. The skyline in the morning looked like a clear canvas, a real sense of potential there. The harbour at sunset looked like the glittering teeth of a shark. The ferry horn sounded 3 times and the boat began to move, grinding and swaying and clanking and chattering and shuddering. There was a beep, a screech, and a gaping silence. There was laughter from the streets through the balmy spring evenings. In brightly lit roads, couples and parties came and went like butterflies among the cars and the bars in the rain. These are so beautiful. The skyscrapers at sunset looked like the shards of tinted glass pointing to the heavens, while the ocean mirrored the raging clouds above. Guys, these are amazing. And if my students wrote stuff like this, I would just cry as I was marking it, because it's really fantastic. And it's really, really achievable within a really short space of time. I'm going to share my screen again. Sorry, Silver, I'm not being super slick here. Just going back to the PowerPoint. So I go back here and then let me know when you can see the full screen. Is that okay? Sylvia, nod at me if you can see my PowerPoint.
Yes,
fantastic.
yes.
Okay, so I'm going to go a little bit to transfer here, because we've talked about the reading and the personal response, which is the choosing. We've talked about the imitation, which is the bit we just did, and the importance of talking out that process out loud. And now I'm going to talk about transfer. And that transfer is the part where we're not writing about the same thing that's in the book. This is quite important. We're not going to use The Great Gatsby as a model for how to write about a party, because that is just copying. And we're not doing copying, we're doing imitation, and there is a difference. The difference is here that we're taking Gatsby's style and we're putting it in Hong Kong. We're taking something that's been written about one place and we're using it to write about something else. And that's where we're making the mental shift, where we're taking the style, but we're not copying the content. And it's an important shift to make. That transfer is where it becomes a strategy rather than just the act of writing out. Now, it's important for students to be aware that this is a strategy that they're using, to be metacognitively aware of. I get better in my writing when I find writing I think is excellent, I identify the bits I think are excellent, and I use those features in my own work. Because that's what's happening, this 3-step process, and be very explicit that that's what they're doing. Now, if we look at the idea of how effective that is, that metacognitive process is considered to be high impact for very low cost, and there's a very large research base that underpins this. This is taken from the EEF work on which educational interventions and strategies work best, and metacognition's right up there. If you're interested in this, there's a link at the bottom. And so in doing so, it's a 3-part process. Students sit down to write, and as they do so, they're thinking, okay, let's plan. What am I being asked to do? Which writers do this well? Which writers do I know are excellent at this? Which are the best writers for detective fiction? Which are the best writers who write about place? And they think, and they're right, that's the writer I want to use here. That's who I'm calling on. Or these are the sentences I know are beautiful and I want to use. So they're aware that they have support, they have a toolkit. Then as they're writing, they start to use them. Does this feel right? Is this the best sentence? Is this in the right order? Does this read beautifully? They monitor how they're doing. And then afterwards they evaluate. How well has this gone? Were these the right sentences to use? Was this the right model for me to choose? The right person to imitate? And giving them this makes them very independent. Eventually you could tell them, okay, you're going to write something here. You're going to write an argumentative piece. And they could say, okay, I know who does that well. I know the kind of sentences I'd want to use if I was doing that. I know the sentences I think are effective. And I'm going to go away and I'm going to find those and I'm going to use them. And then I'm going to consider how that went, or if I need to use and lean on other good writers next time. Now, there are very structured ways of doing this. And this is a nice example from the literature, where ideally at the beginning, you model this process. You show as a teacher how you borrow from other writers. If you stand at the front of the class and you just write something amazing out of your own head, all the students will see is that you are a super excellent writer, you are a conceptual genius, and there's no way that they can copy what you can do because the whole thing is invisible. If you model being able to say, right, I'm not sure how to do this, but I know a writer who does, I'm going to go to that writer, that's where they do it really well, I'm going to borrow that, and I'm going to adapt it to this context and put it in. Students can see that. They can see what you had to do to get there, and they can copy that, and that can make them better. So your cognitive modeling at the beginning is really important. Doing it together as a class, so they're involved in the process, or together in small groups, is then important, so they're closer to it. Then they can do it as a pair or in small groups. And then if you want to, this faded overt self-guidance, they can talk to themselves while they're doing their own writing if they're comfortable to, and you can listen to them do it. And then finally, they absorb it into their own process. But it's a stepped through process that happens verbally, because writing is invisible. And that's why people think they can't do it, because the process by which we get better is hidden. We need to make it verbal. How do we get better? How do we copy and borrow from others? How do we do that live in front of you? Because when we think about writing, it looks like this, you know? We plan, we think about what we're going to do, we draft, we revise it, we edit. It's actually probably more like this, because it's a back and forth. I come up with an idea, I might show it to someone or talk to someone about it. I might write a first draft. I might do some more research because I didn't feel like I knew what I was doing. I'll revise it, I'll go back, I'll start that paragraph again. It's more messy. But actually, when we think about how writing feels, it feels like this, right? I know I have a period of writing, and this is why we procrastinate, where I sit down to do my writing and I'm scared. I've got a blank page in front of me. I'm like, I've got no idea what I'm going to write. I'm not sure that this is going to go as well as I hope. I want it to be really good, but I'm not sure I can make it good. It's a messy process. So, and it's important to model that to our students as well. It's a messy process and you often need to lean on something to get started. And modeling that start, modeling everything about writing live. So not preparing a model in advance, but standing there in front of your students and say, I'm going to write something and I'm going to show you how I write. And I'm going to show you how sometimes I stop and I stare into space and it's tricky. I'm going to show you that sometimes I need to go away and find an example. Sometimes I struggle to find the words. Sometimes I need to swap out words because they're still not saying the right things. It's risky. And as a teacher, it's really quite scary. And you can't do it for a very long time if you've got a class that struggles to maintain attention. But it's incredibly powerful because your students aren't seeing something ready-made and beautiful. They're seeing your process in the moment. And seeing that process is how they learn what their own process is. They see you borrow from other places. They see you imitate. And by doing that, they learn that's what they need to do themselves. So this is the final piece. After this, I've only got the bibliography and a picture again. And so I've taken Dylan Thomas, who I love, really lyrical. And I've just got an extract on screen. And we're just going to do the first process in our head and say, okay, if I gave you this as a reader, which bits would you want to imitate? Which bits do you want to borrow and copy? And pop it in the chat. The second one, inventing collective nouns, parallel structure and the use of repetition, all of that. So the collective nouns in this are beautiful. Okay, Aubrey, you're loving the pairs, tawny and savage with cruel nails and rapacious mouths. If anyone wants to talk out loud here, do so. But for me, the collective nouns here are incredible. And it's an easy thing to teach. August bank holiday. A tune on an ice cream cornet, a slap of sea and a tickle of sand. My favorite is the compromise of paddlers. They're half in, half out. They can't make their mind up. All of these are made up. So we're just taking words, a sunburn of girls. Yeah, it's brilliant. A wince and a whinny of bathers. We're just taking one word and using it to describe a group of other people. Collective nouns are really fun. And we can just make those up. A hullaballoon of balloons here. So collective nouns we could do, you could imagine a wonderful class task where we take all these different options. If you think about the skyscrapers in Hong Kong, what would they be? Would they be a huddle of skyscrapers? Would they be, I'm trying to think of something sharp here. Would they be a haystack of skyscrapers? We're just going to make up our own collective nouns for the features we might see in that picture. We've also got this lovely structure of I remember, I remember, I remember through this piece. And that's also really, really easy to imitate. So let's borrow I remember, I remember. I like that. We're going to take the collective nouns. We're going to take I remember. We're going to take the pairs, tawny and savage, cruel nails and rapacious. Okay, we've got some stuff to steal. Fabulous. And we don't need to know what every single word means. We don't need to analyze what Dylan Thomas was trying to do. We just need to know that we love it and there are bits we're going to borrow. And then we could take this whole piece and apply it to this picture. A squawk of skyscrapers. Yes, Elizabeth, that's exactly what I'm talking about. That's a beautiful collective noun. We could talk about, oh, we've got a little clutch of trees there. I want to talk about something about the traffic. So I've got a flow of traffic. I've got a lava flow of traffic. Maybe that doesn't feel quite right. A guard of skyscrapers. You guys are much better because I don't get my best ideas while I'm presenting in the moment. But we could take this picture, develop collective nouns for everything we see, a rolling of clouds. Perhaps at the top, we could take all those different bits, write that first paragraph, and then I remember, and structure our memories through the piece, a cluster of clouds. Excellent. And do that, a burst of skyscrapers. And then we could create an incredible piece of work in the style of Dylan Thomas about Hong Kong. And it's only taken us a few minutes to work out which bits we love and which bits we want to steal. So that is my main takeaway here, that we have a three-step process, a gossiping of traffic. Yes, we look at what we love in the literature. We imitate the bits we want, a flame of streetlights, and then we transfer it to a different context. And it's a really simple process, but it's incredibly powerful. And it's a good example of a low threshold, high challenge task. It works well for our students who struggle to come into writing. It works well for our highest attainers who need a professional model to extend them. And was personally the most successful writing strategy I employed as an English teacher in my teaching career. Okay, and that's it. So we have a few minutes for questions if anybody wants to unmute and talk, or if you just want to sit and think. I'd like you to think about what from today would you like to take away, and if you can think of just two things that you'd like to borrow, or one thing that you'd like to take away into your teaching, or how you work with writers of any age, then just note those down. Thank you, Sylvia, for popping the feedback form in there. Please complete it, because that's how we know how we can make sure that these webinars are exactly what you need. Oh, thanks for the comments in the chats, guys. Yes, the difference between copying and imitation. They're different, aren't they? It's powerful. Thank you. Yes, model every step, even that you're scared. Imitation is amazing with poetry. Amazing. Copying whole poems or just bits of poems. Yes, for teenagers, ask them. Right? Ask them. I learned so much from the reading habits of my teenagers, and a lot of my favorite books now are young adult fiction, especially people like Patrick Ness, who managed to combine really good action with really beautiful writing styles. Borrow from them. It's quite powerful if you can use your students' own favorites to get them to imitate, because a lot of teenagers are big on fan fiction. And this is what fan fiction is, essentially. It's about taking a context and imitating it out. So if you can get them to bring their own text in, that's super powerful as well. Yes. Introduce your own favorites. Your passion goes a long way. Yeah. I love being totally cheesy when I'm teaching, going over the top in my enthusiasm, a little bit like I've been in this webinar, for all things words and sentences and books. And doing that, they may not tell you, but you will bring your teenagers along with you.